Hello, hello. My name is Linda, also known as Tortajala around the internet. I love creative journaling and all things stationery. And today I have this Traveler's Company passport notebook in camel color. And you can see it's already been a little bit altered. A long while back, I had this idea to use stamps to heat emboss images onto the cover. And I tried it out, but it didn't really work out as I had intended. And I sort of just stopped and gave up. And you can see this passport traveler's notebook is pretty old and bashed up. My daughter even wrote on the inside cover. It has like old glue residue from some pockets. So it really needs some love and care right now. And in an effort to use my stuff, like looking to my stash and realizing that I have a lot of stationery supplies already, but I'm obviously not using all of them. It's just too easy to be tempted by the latest new product, new releases, just too much scrolling and being influenced. So, one of the remedies to that is to get to creating and doing something with the things that I already have rather than looking around at what's new or like what's on sale. So, I have a fair amount of rubber stamps. Many of them are from like card making and scrapbooking days, but I've also bought some new ones too because let's face it, it's easy to succumb to pretty imagery. But I don't find myself always using them, maybe because there's just like more steps because you need the ink and the stamp, to put in your journals. And many of my old stamps are definitely very bashed up, stained as well. I'm also not great at cleaning and organizing them. So I just thought this is definitely a good opportunity to look through what I have and decide what I want to keep and also use them instead of having them just collect dust in my drawer. So I'm looking through all my stamps and trying to decide what I want to use to fill up the entire outside of my Camel Passport TN with stamp designs. Now, I know from my previous attempt that words and like tiny details, they just aren't going to come out perfectly. Probably I don't have like all the perfect tools. And again, I'm just going to use what I have, so I will have to live with that. But if you don't already know, what I'm doing is heat embossing. Basically, I'm going to use the stamps and stamp with Versamark ink, which is a special type of clear but sticky type of ink, so that then you pour heat embossing powder over it. So the powder only sticks to the image you stamped. Then you heat the powder with a heat gun, so the powder melts and sets. So you're sort of creating like a raised texture, sort of relief of the image that you stamped on your paper, or in this case, on my leather TN. And of course, there are different embossing powder like types, like colors and effects. There are also many different brands and tools out there that you can get, but I want to stress I'm not buying anything new. I am just using what I have. And a little disclaimer here, I do not want to influence you in getting new products at all. Rather, I just wanted to share this idea of looking at your stationery stash. Like, what supplies or tools do you already have that are being neglected? So maybe it's time to start a project using those things? So that's what I'm doing here. I haven't used my heat embossing tools and supplies in like years and years. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the entire rocky road experience of stamping and customizing this Passport TN. I will also share tips and revelations along the way in case you ever want to embark on this challenge yourself. I'm not an expert, but I have definitely picked up a few tips, like what I should have done differently if I were to do this again. So, first, what I'm doing is going through all of my stamps that I have at my disposal and trying to figure out, like, how do I want to position them to cover up my entire passport cover outside. Like, I'm gonna try to make like a collage montage of like stamp images to fill up all the space. Now, the best way to figure this all out is to stamp it out on paper first. And this took me quite some time because I had an idea, but just trying to fit all the stamps in a layout that seems pretty balanced, or at least to my taste, it definitely took time. It's like jigsaw puzzle kind of layout issue. So I tried laying the stamps out to get an idea of what could be possible, but eventually I just like traced the passport TN size on a piece of white paper. So I could actually stamp out the images and see how it would all look together. And of course, I ended up trying many different like configurations because we all know, like, you think something's gonna work out, but then when you have it in real life, like if you stamp it out and look at it, you might change your mind. So I think it's really important to do this to figure out what you want. You need to have some sort of a game plan, like a template. You will probably do a lot of trials and take time to sort of like figure out what is your final image. So, here are a few tips that I realized after the fact as I kept trying this out on paper to see different combinations and layouts in figuring out what stamps I wanted to use and where. One thing you can actually do is stamp out all your images and then cut them out. Then you can move them around on your DN, and that could save some time in like stamping and restamping the entire layout every single time, like the way that I did on white paper. Even though I had fun and um, it was almost like practice in using my stamps again to familiarize myself with each stamp, it would obviously make more sense to have the stamp images separate so that you can like move them around and change your layout. This is also important if you want to overlap stamp images. I didn't do that for this project, but if you do, you can also use like vellum or transparent type of paper or even plastic if you have stamp ink that would stay on it, because then you can cut out all those stamp images and actually overlap them and see how they would look in your final collage. I honestly could even find any vellum paper in my stash for whatever reason, so that's why I just kept doing it on white paper over and over again until I came out with my final, like, what I wanted to do. Another thing I realized, like halfway through playing around with my stamps, is that the traveler's notebook obviously has the center binding part where there are holes on the top and bottom. And there on the top, there's also that metal tension thingy that holds the elastic on the top. So you obviously have to remember to accommodate for these parts of the TN. You can stamp an image over these sections, but it's just important to realize that they are there, and of course they will affect like how the images look in the end. There's also the Traveler's Notebook logo and branding on the back lower left-hand corner, so you have to remember those elements and how you would incorporate them into your final stamping layout. One another thing that I forgot about was the little hole on the back cover where the elastic goes through. I had not even thought about that this whole time until the very end when I was actually stamping my TN already. Thankfully, it didn't make a difference for me in my scenario, but depending on what stamps you're using, it might be an important thing to consider. Finally, the other thing to consider is that this whole time I was working on the giant rectangular shape of the entire passport TN. But of course, you have to realize that this is a TN cover, so it's going to be folded in half. So there's the binding, which is the center, and then you're most often going to be like seeing the front part, and then there's the back part. So again, just another thing to keep in mind if you want things to be like centered, if you want things to appear on the front cover of the TN, or how it would wrap over like the spine area. All of those things are important to consider so that you know what the final product is going to be. Again, that's why I think it is important to, in the end, like do a trial where you stamp it on like a white piece of paper or, colored piece of paper. And like that way you can use that piece of paper, like fold it in half and be like, okay, this is what my TN is going to end up being. Now, when it comes to stamps, the clear acrylic type of stamp is obviously very helpful in this case because you can see exactly where you're stamping, as opposed to wooden stamps, which sometimes they're not even mounted on straight. They could be crooked or off center, so it's really hard to know where you are stamping. If you're creating a collage, like it's important, right? So I had a lot of issues with this because I just found it to be really challenging to know exactly where the final stamp image was going to be if it wasn't one of those clear stamps. Obviously, I don't have perfect, stamping skills. I know that there exists tools out there that can help you like position your stamps in specific, like places, but again, I don't have any of those tools and I just had to go with my gut and hope for the best. Not ideal, but again, this year I'm just going for it. I wanted to fill up this Passport TN with designs. I wanted to get this project done because it basically has always been on my mind. Every time I see this TN, I'm like, "Oh, I never finished stamping that." Um, that was my original intention, was to fill it all up. So now that I had all the supplies like out, I was just going for it. I wasn't going to back down no matter what like issues came up. So there were definitely nerves and doubts along this whole process, but I just kept plowing through. So, another note, you might have noticed the stamped images that I already had on my Passport TM, they look different. And that's because I used different embossing powders for each one. The lower one is like sparkly and clear, and then the one on top is white. And you can see they don't, obviously look the same. You, of course, can always do tests on paper and, you know, try things out before you actually work on your TN. But I know that it's definitely hard to know what it's going to look like until you see it on leather, right? My first tries, they didn't work out that well, and that's why I had stopped in the first place. But basically, one of the problems is that um, some stamps have very fine details, and I don't have any ultra fine embossing powder. Like my embossing powder is pretty coarse, I guess, like it's meant for, just bigger images. So all of the details, they are gonna get lost and they will sort of be like a big blob. So that's one issue. Another issue is that the white embossing powder I have, it just seems to spread all over the place. And I'm not sure if it's because of user error or maybe it's just very old and, just the situation. But it's problematic, and that is what sort of like stopped me in the process the first time around. But as I kept looking at this TN, like I thought, let me change my perspective. It looks sort of grungy, so I should just run with that and do the whole grungy feel. And that's why I was like, it makes so much more sense to just cover the entire Passport TN with all of like different images. It would look so much more grungy and cool, even if the stamp images are, blobby or not perfect or don't have like all the tiny details. Just let it be grungy. And I think that actually matches the whole Traveler's Notebook vibe, anyways. And I don't have the skills or the tools to be like to make it like perfect imagery anyway. So again, work with what you have, right? For those who come from the like scrapbooking or heat embossing world, you'll know that you are supposed to use a tool or like a dryer sheet or something to rub over the area you're going to work on because it's supposed to take away like the static um, that might make the embossing powder stick to places that it's not supposed to stick to. So that is one thing to consider. That definitely was what was causing issues when I was using the white embossing powder because it would just like go all over the place. There'll be like little tidbits everywhere. And I guess it worked out in the end because I was going for sort of the grunginess and it made that grunginess. But that's one thing to consider. By the way, I don't know if I need to like do a disclaimer, but I assume no responsibility for any alterations you make to your TNs because I am just sharing my process with you as I stumble my way forward. Um, So again, I don't know if it's because of the materials that I have. They're obviously many years old, and I don't know if it changes like embossing powders. And again, I don't have ultra fine embossing powder, so none of the tiny details are going to show up in the stamps. They all sort of get muddled up and like really, again, grungy and blobby together. But yeah, I just realized that I've been way too much of a perfectionist in wanting to stamp and create a cool montage for this cover, and it just made me in the end not do anything. So I don't want to fall into that trap of either buying more supplies because I think I need them to be able to do the project. Um, I mean, it's not going to be quote unquote perfect anyway. So I am just going with it. And that is definitely a thing for this year in 2025 is just to stop being so much in my head, because we always think of like good ideas, good cool projects, but then we like never act on them because, oh, maybe I'm missing this or need to do that or the conditions have to be right. So I'm just trying to reject all of those like excuses all the time, and I'm just going to go for it this year to use all the things and have fun along the way, because ultimately that is what the stationery hobby is supposed to be about, right? To create, fun creative times and play with all of our, stationary things. So once I had my like stamp montage collage figured out, I basically had to prep my TN. So I did like end up just removing the all the elastics and even the little metal thingy, because of course you want a flat surface to stamp on. And so you'll just like have to reconstruct your TN after the fact. And one thing that I failed to do was to clean all my stamps because I was doing all the trials using a colored stamp ink, but obviously the Versamark ink is like a clear sticky. So like as I was starting to actually stamp on my TN, then I had to like clean all my stamps in between, and some of them were still not clean, and I got my ink pad dirty anyways. But yeah, don't do what I do. You should probably do it the proper way, which is like to clean all the stamps and have them ready to go so that this process would be a little bit smoother. But again, I just sort of like once I started, I sort of like was like in this mode of like I need to finish. So like I just need to get it done. So I just went ahead. So the first image that I decided to stamp and emboss was actually the center binding part, because what I ended up doing is just choosing a bunch of stamps to like lined up to fill up that binding part, and that would be where like the fold of the passport is. So I wanted to do that first so that it would be like perfectly in the center, and then like try to fill in the rest of it outward, and hopefully that would help with the positioning a bit more. And later on, I'm going to change like the process of what like the order in which I'm doing things. Like you might see me go off camera a lot, but for this first one I was trying to show everything on camera, so everything was like cramped up in my space. But basically I did do a test on the paper first to make sure like, okay, does it even come out like slightly legible, because there are words on these stamps, and you'll see that it is does look very blobby-ish, but it's good enough for me for the whole grungy look. But basically, the way that heat embossing works is that you use the Versamark ink to stamp so that it like has the sticky part of the stamp image, and then you pour the embossing powder, and the excess you're supposed to pour like get rid of. So you usually just pour it back into the container, any of the excess powder. But basically, the powder sticks to only what you stamped, right? Because it's sticky. Of course, I did have some issues with that because, again, your embossing powder, there's different types of embossing powders and some are finer than others. So if it's not that fine, obviously you're not going to get a good impression. It's almost like sand, right? Like, are you sticking to it? If it was a fine powder, it would obviously stick to the details and show better, right? But I just wanted to show the process. And the reason why I had to change my whole setup is because I had like embossing powder just flying all over my desk, which is not good. You should probably be doing this in a different, like a box or something, so that you could catch the loose embossing powder that flies all over or over like the trash can or something. But just to show you the process, like you stamp it, you get the embossing powder, and then you use a heat gun. And a heat gun is different from a hair dryer. I know that both creates heat, but the problem is the hair dryer is blowing air. So it might actually blow some of your embossing powder like to the wrong place or away, or, cause issues. A heat gun is like a stream of heat. So I know it like has air, but it's just not the same. So it's like very, very hot heat, and you basically are melting the embossing powder. So you can see, I just wanted to show you in camera like what was happening. Basically, once it melts, you'll see that the color goes away because it is all melted and melded together and creates that like cool, tactile surface. So that is what I'm gonna do all over my TN. So I'm going to show you all the footage that I have recorded, but sort of speed through it because it's like I'm doing the same thing um, over and over again. Basically, I am getting the stamp, putting it in the Versamark ink, stamping it on my TN, then pouring the embossing powder, and then, getting rid of the excess, then heating it up so that it, molds to your TN. And I sort of did these in parts simply because I I didn't want it to dry up and then not stick to the embossing powder, and it just seemed easier to do it like piece by piece. One thing to note, if you're using the clear acrylic stamps, if you make a mistake and you see that it's not, enough like watermark or Versamark ink, you can definitely restamp it. And I did do that for like the little house. Um, because I don't know, I just got a bad impression. But because I can see exactly where it was fine to like add more to make sure that there was enough of that sticky ink to get the embossing powder. Of course, that little house shape, it has way too many details, so those little details would be lost basically. Like the line is too fine, it just becomes like a general house shape. So for most of the stamp images, I used clear embossing powder. So the embossing powder basically has no color. It's like almost like a clear, um, I want to say plastic, but I don't know what material it is. Just like a clear material. So it just makes it look like darker on the TN. But at some point, I wanted to add some of the white embossing powder to sort of like match the one that I already had on the TN in the upper right hand corner. So it's like I wanted some white parts like here and there throughout the whole composition just to like tie it all together. So what I did was stamp everything and use the clear embossing powder on everything, but then on some I added white like on top. So I know a lot of it definitely looks grungy, but again, I guess I can just say I'm going for that look, right? And in the end, I'm happy with how it turned out. And there are like some that look like a little crooked here and there, but I think as a whole, it's not too bad. Obviously, it's handmade kind of thing, like homemade, handmade. But I like that I finally got to it and just did the thing instead of staring at it every single time and thinking, oh, I should have finished stamping this TN. I should have finished stamping this TN. So now it's done. And for those who are interested, the stamps I used, starting from the upper left-hand corner, Linda is stamped with the alphabet set that I have. I just got it off AliExpress, so there's like no name. And then the little parentheses stamp, I can't really remember where I got it from, but it was from one of the stationery shops in Europe. And if we go down in the lower left, that's an LCN stamp, like postage stamp with a fern on it. stamp. Sorry, I don't know. Can't remember the names. And then that ink bottle stamp is also from AliExpress. And then the little mail, which now just looks like a rectangle, but inside there is like a happy mail, which is something that I designed myself. So it was a custom stamp. And then throughout, I used um, a star and a heart and the airplane and those kinds of stamps that were from like a Teresa Collins very old like self-inking stamp kind of thing, but then I just used them separately. And then the binding is from like a very old Hero Arts acrylic stamp set that had a bunch of like little bits, and I chose those four for the binding. And then on the upper part, the house, I believe, is from like an old Studio Calico set. The girl looking at her phone and the right hand side girl looking at the blooms, those are from Black Milk Project. And the white stamp right in the middle there is a bunch of dates. It's actually January to December and then 1 to 31, like all those letters and numbers all mixed up. But that is also a random stamp from AliExpress. And then the rest of the stamps were all from like very old Studio Calico acrylic stamps that you're supposed to like put together and like, use for planning or labeling or in your scrapbooking. So it's just like a big mishmash. But just wanted to go through that quickly if in case you were wondering where these stamp images are from. I think that more than anything, it just made me realize that the hesitations that we always have, they stop us from doing something that is fun and enjoyable. When it comes to the end product, like, sure, it's nice to have something we like, but really, it's nice to have it done, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Rather than to not have it done. So I think that's sort of the major, I guess, lesson, if you want to call it that. Yeah, so that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed seeing like my whole crazy process. And again, I wanted to share to basically encourage you to look at your stationery stash and see what has been neglected and how you might actually use those things, or maybe decide that you need to destash it because it is just taking up space. So if you have any opinions or feedback, please let me know down in the comments. I really would love to hear from you. If you like this video, please hit the like button. And if you enjoy stationery videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you being here and supporting me. I hope you have a very lovely day. And until next time, bye.